We've talked a little bit about point of sale, but here we're going to go into a little bit more detail. As we mentioned, obviously the point of sale is how we account for what was sold, and we're going to need to match up sales against usage. So we're going to deep dive and just explain this in more detail. So the number one rule or starting point is that every pour has its own button. We sometimes use the expression one drink, one button, meaning that every single drink has its own dedicated button. And just a point of clarification here is that it needs to identify both the product and the specific size of the pour. So if you're using a button, Jack Daniels, to do a regular cocktail, perhaps an ounce and a half, and then it's also used when you're pouring a rocks pour, which is larger, we have a problem there, partly because you're not charging the correct amount for the extra pour, and partly because there's no precise record of how much of that product was sold. Another important one is that these point of sale buttons need to be added before any new product is sold. And this is just a silly one really. If you're going to sell the product, eventually you're going to have to add a button for it. It makes things a lot cleaner and tidier if you do that beforehand. So with a little bit of forethought and organization, and honestly, if you're bringing in products without any forethought and organization, we have a problem with that. So very important, if you have considered that you're going to choose to bring on this new product, it's very important you put a point of sale button into the system before it goes onto the floor. Otherwise, there's the chance that people don't know how to charge for it correctly, and you're just going to create a bad overall experience and possibly cost yourself money by undercharging. So anytime we have any exceptions, if you're ringing things in a way that doesn't identify what was poured, again, it needs to identify both the product being poured and the size. We would please appreciate very much some communication, and ideally, we'd actually update the point of sale system, make some changes so that situation doesn't happen in the future. So this is a good aim to have. I need to explain this, but we want to reduce our unknown rings down below 1% of sales within 2 months. So first of all, what is an unknown ring? Well, sometimes there are occasions in your point of sale setup where we know the quantity of product which was sold, but we're not able to determine which specific product it was that was sold. An example is if you use generic rocks modifiers. So at most bars, because the point of sale is programmed in a kind of not an optimal way, when you ring up a Jack Daniels on the rocks, you first press the Jack Daniels button, and that indicates to us an ounce and a half of product is being poured, and then you press a generic modifier which perhaps adds $2 or $3, and that modifier will just be called rocks or on the rocks. The problem there is that we know that we're pouring an extra half ounce of product in most cases, but when we look at the aggregated weekly sales report, it will tell us how many times that rocks modifier was pressed, and not how many of those times related to Jack Daniels, how many was Jim Beam, how many was Johnny Walker Black, and therefore we'll have to just do an ounce and or half an ounce, of product, and we'll call that product unknown liquor, so that we correctly account for the amount, but obviously we can't specifically line it up to the product. What that does is create grey area and questions in our reports, so we want to pragmatically and incrementally make changes to the point of sale report so that we can get away from that situation, and we provide complimentary advice to do that. So a few additional details on the point of sale. BarI tracks usage of every product you carry and compares the usage to the sales. This requires an exact record of sales be available. So as we said, there's going to be, in most cases, you're going to have this correct. There's probably a few occasions where this isn't correct. A recent one we had with a new product or a new bar was that they had all their drafts correctly named in there by draft name. So you had, you rang up a Coors Light, you rang up a Bud Light. The one thing was that they had a second size of beer. They did 23-ounce larger beers, and when you wanted to upgrade a customer to a larger beer, you just pressed 23-ounce beer and added a fixed charge. Again, the issue there is twofold. One, we're not charging an appropriate amount for the extra beer because we're charging the same amount for the extra ounces of Bud Light as we are for a craft beer, which probably costs almost twice as much. And then the other issue is, again, we don't have a precise record of exactly what those extra ounces of beer sold in 23 ounce, whether they were Bud Light or other items. So the worst case of using or not having a complete sales record is to use call well buttons. Call well premium, super premium is the typical way it's done. That is very, very costly to your bar business. I can't emphasize enough, if you're doing that at your bar currently, we need to talk. You have serious problems. You're really not using your multi-$1,000 point of sale system in the way it was designed, and you're probably costing your business quite a lot of money. A less extreme example that we've discussed is those generic modifiers. Most commonly that's a rocks double martini, sometimes a Manhattan modifier. And again, the problem there is we press those generic modifiers regardless of the product being served. It charges a fixed amount, which is silly because the product varies in cost, and it doesn't provide us a record. Also, open buttons means that probably you're using open button because there isn't a correct way to ring it into the system. So again, you can fix that simply by addressing that issue. So we provide complimentary advice on this. If you have any questions, we're more than willing to explain how it is that we need to make specific changes, and your account manager will work with you specifically. And again, we try and put a 2-month limit on this. We don't want this to drag on. It's very tedious, honestly, and boring, some of these updates we have to make into your point of sale system. It might require a couple of hours of office time sat making these programs. However, once it's done, and your business and the effectiveness of bar I reports will benefit for the rest of the time going forward. So it's not too exciting, but we really appreciate if you can do that work up front. It will yield benefit on the back end to everyone. I mentioned it before, but we follow the principle of one drink, one button. If you look up this article online, you can actually get a link or just do a search for one drink, one button, and that explains in more detail what we're going over here. Again, we mentioned private parties, but they do have the ability to ruin an entire cycle. So let's just explain the ideal way. When you have a private party, regardless if you're charging the customer per drink, many times you sell a private party and it's $10 a head. So in some respects, you don't care what they drink because you're just going to give it to them. Either way, it's good to ring up those drinks drink by drink. It reinforces that idea that we're careful about ringing things up. And then later on, if you comp that and therefore wipe out the dollars, do not void it because you'll erase all record of that tab. But if you later comp it, that will mean that you're not missing, or you don't have to tie up the dollars, but there'll be that exact record of precisely what drinks were sold, meaning you don't have to record or remember what you were serving during the private party. So that's absolutely the best way to do it. When you have a private party, ring up the drinks individually and comp them after the event. I tell you another reason why that's beneficial is if you sell your party at $10 a head and you track how much booze was actually used at retail, you'll be able to figure out if you're over or underselling your parties, because if the average dollars spent at retail by your customers was perhaps $12, you might be okay. We gave them a 20% discount because it was a group function. If it creeps up to be $14 a person, we might start to think about charging them a little bit more. Final word on point of sale is point of sale systems get upgraded. They have a new version. Sometimes you'll choose a new one. Anytime a significant change to your point of sale system like that occurs, it would be really beneficial to us if you can tell us. The reason being is if we know in advance, often we can make sure that the new system is programmed in a way that there will be a seamless transition, make sure that the button descriptions are the same, and either way we will be able to minimize the extra work and therefore related charges to this. And another thing to say is that because we're an independent business and we work with a lot of different bars, we will have an opinion on which point of sale systems work well for you. I always say I think that all of them, for the most part, can do what you need them to do, and so the quality of local service is really important. But overall, we'll have an opinion. So if you have questions and you want an independent viewpoint on, are we going to choose this point of sale, are we going to choose this one, we can always do that. And obviously, we have no vested interest in which point of sale you choose, so you'll get good independent advice.